Hey guys, this is Phil Galfon for RunItOnce.com, and today I am kicking off a new series called Thinking Out Loud. I'm a poker player who does a lot of my learning, both at and away from the table, by just constantly thinking through decisions that I have to make or have made, and decisions that my opponents have made. And I mean every other aspect of the game, honestly. I think about it all the time, and a good deal of thoughts are kind of worthless and don't lead to anything, but occasionally I come up with something that I think is worth exploring. At the very least, will be interesting. And this series will be my medium to explore those thoughts, both with myself and with you. This will be episode one, and I've titled it "Leaks Hiding in Plain Sight." This is a no limit focused and inspired video. However, the concept can be applied to PLO and definitely any big bet game, and probably can be extrapolated in some ways to any poker game. When I was playing the Heads Up Superstar Showdown on PokerStars, I got to play against Jungle Man. I got to play against Ben86, and in preparation for it, I got to play against Canu7. And those guys are certainly three of the top no-limit players in the world. Even though I know Ben specifically has put in much more volume at PLO lately, but I still consider him one of the best no limit players from the amount that I know about no limit. Anyways, there was something that I was doing that all three of them were not. And usually, when that happens, when three of the best players in the world disagree with you and all agree with each other, it means that you're very often wrong, and at the very least, you should take a good hard look at your idea. And that's what we'll be doing today. And I don't think that I'm wrong, but if you guys disagree with me, I'd love to find out. So without further ado, we'll kick it off. So I'm going to start off with the hand history. This is a made-up hand at 10-20 no limit, about 100 big blinds deep. We're on the button and we raise with ace six suited. The big blind calls. Flop king 10-6. We check back, and he checks to us on an offsuit deuce. And start considering, do we want to bet this hand for protection? Do we want to bet this hand for value? Do we want to check it back and make some decisions on rivers? Usually it gets checked down. Sometimes we have to decide whether to call bet or not. Sometimes we decide if we want to value bet our third pair, and sometimes we improve. And not the most interesting decision ever, but it leads us to not only think about what we should do with this hand, but what we should do with our range. So in building our range, what do we consider? We obviously want to start with worrying about balance and game theory, which means we want to be unexploitable, or at least close enough to unexploitable that it's not obvious to our opponent what to do. And, we want to bet the top of our range. We want to bet, I wouldn't actually say the bottom of our range. We want to bet some weak hands, but in many spots, if your opponent's not folding enough, you don't want to bet the absolute bottom of your range because you just don't have enough immediate fold equity and you have no equity. I probably could go back and change that right now, but I'm not going to. But basically, we want to be betting in all of our value hands, or with the exception of being a little tricky and checking back. But it's getting late in the hand to continue being tricky, because there's just not many more streets or betting decisions where we can capitalize on that. And so we want to bet the top of our range, and we also want to bet the right amount of bluffs that our opponent can't either easily fold or easily raise. Yeah. Some other considerations: we need to think about our flop check back range. We need to think about how rivers are going to play out. Something I always advocate is not just thinking about plays in a vacuum on that street, but looking at your immediate EV, although it's very important, but looking at the ways that the hand can play out on future streets. We want to consider deception, but like I said, we don't want to be too deceptive at this point. Once the flop's gun check through, if we check back the turn, we're just seeing a river with usually 0 or 1 bets going in. We want to bet, and we want to think about his ranges. Obviously, if his range is exploitable, as I think many are in this spot, when they give you the opportunity to delay c-bet, then we might want to skew our ranges a little bit to account for that. So our simplified conclusion here, these are some hands that I think we could be checking back the flop with, and we could would be a good part of most people's betting ranges. So let's say we want to value bet Queen 6 plus any 10, and then obviously any two pair set combo. We want to semi bluff our gutters with no showdown. So in this case, I'm assuming we're actually going to check back like ace jack, which is debatable. We'll semi bluff with our open enders. We'll semi bluff with our flush draws. I think that you could tweak these ranges quite a bit. They're very rough, but that's not really the point of this video, so I didn't want to spend too much time covering it. Let's look at things from the other side. All right, so now we're in the big blind with Jack 10, and the action is the same. We call. After the button raises, flop goes check, check. We check the turn. He bets. And now we have to consider what we're going to do. And, you know, with Jack 10 specifically, once we get to this spot, I think that calling is probably the best play by a large margin. But once again, we have to consider our whole range. So how do we build our range? We need to think about how thin we can check raise for value. Jack 10 was probably a little bit too thin. Although against some people's flop checkback ranges, it could be reasonable. Could we check raise ace 10 for value? Can we check raise a king for value? How weak of a king? We also need to consider how often we show up with value hands, taking into account our ranges thus far. We need to think about how many bluffs we can include to balance that out, especially, you know, how many legitimate semi-bluffs, decent semi-bluffs. But here, we actually have to wait a second because we've gotten ahead of ourselves. So same hand history, and the action's exactly the same. But this is actually where we need to stop. Before we check, we need to consider if we want this hand in our betting range, and we need to consider what hands we want in our betting range in general, and what hands we want in our checking range, and then what to do from there. And if you think about it, it's a lot to build. Your betting range and checking range sounds easy enough, but when you consider it further, you have to have hands to bet fold, you have to have hands to bet call, you have to have hands to bet raise. You need check fold hands, check call hands, check raise hands, and then once you check raise, you can fold call or re-raise. And these are kind of all things you need to plan out before you check. You can't just indiscriminately check and then, you know, have a good idea of your ranges, or it would be a mistake to, let's say, check maybe a jack high flush draw there. Then you're facing a bet and you think, oh, well, I don't really want to call because I have jack high, so maybe I should turn this into a semi bluff and check raise. When really in the first place it might have just been a better spot to bet. So where do we put our strongest value hands? Do we want them in our betting range? Do we want them in our check raise range? Where are we going to put our marginals? It's really a lot to think about, and it's tough because we have to balance all of these ranges, assuming our opponent's competent, which he is. So in building a range, I came up with a rough example of a range. Once again, this isn't. I think it's important to go through the process of building a range because I think this is what any good poker player does, especially people who put a lot of time into no limit. So I wanted to give you guys an example of how to build a range and to get some rough approximations. So I decided we'll bet some of our nuts. By nuts, I don't mean literal nuts. I mean, let's say two pair plus. Because those are effectively the nuts. I mean, sometimes we'll have a weak two pair and our opponent will have a stronger two pair, but it's a small consideration. We're going to bet most of our mid-high value hands and most of our weak to strong non-showdown value draws, which leaves us checking some of our nuts, obviously to check raise, checking some low-mid showdown value, probably to check call. Some strong draws with showdown value to check call, some weak draws with showdown value, probably also to check call. Either of these can also be check raised, we can consider. Some strong draws with no showdown value, we can either check call or check raise. Some weak draws with no showdown value would probably be just a check fold. And then obviously we'll check a good amount of our, hopeless hands because we don't think there's enough immediate fold equity in just betting them, and certainly not enough equity to improve to make our semi-bluff viable, and we're not going to be check raising with these total air hands either. A lot of you guys have talked about wanting to see, more pro poker tools, odds oracle videos, and I would not consider myself an expert, but at this point, what you would do next, I can, I can, I can at least touch on. I've played around with this program a little bit, and I actually will be playing around with it a lot more, as it seems a lot of the members want to learn more about how to use it, and I'm going to need to get better at using it if I'm going to teach you guys. But so let's say we enter the board, which is king of spades, ten of spades, I believe is six of hearts, two of clubs, and we're just looking at our the big blind's range, our range in the big blind, and let's assume we fold 20% of the time pre-flop, giving us a VPIP of 80%, and then let's say we 3-bet 20%. So this, I believe, is going to give us, as far as pre-flop hands, the top 80% of hands minus the top 20%. So we're going from, just like it says, 20 to 80%. And we're going to click on a question. We are going to look at interactive hand stats on the turn. And we're going to click start. And what this will give us, as it runs fairly quickly, it's going to give us a breakdown of how often we have sets, how often we have pairs, how often we have two pair, how often we have flush draws, and every combination of that. So you scroll down, and as of now, it doesn't have anything. It just shows us our absolute hand strength. But you can add in straight outs, you can add in flush draws, and you can even add in overcards. So on this board of king high, that means we can account for when we have ace high. And this is a rough breakdown of the range, or this is an exact. Well, it's actually they simulate a bunch of trials, so it's somewhat rough, but it's near an exact approximation of how many we're going to how often we're going to have each of those hands, assuming that we're checking the flop with 100% of our range. Okay, so here I've taken what PBT Odds Oracle spit out at me and divided it up roughly based on some of the guidelines that we talked about earlier. I broke it up into four ranges. I did not get into bet calling, bet folding, and bet raising, nor did I get into check raise calling, check raise folding, check raise re-raising, because this is complex enough. And once again, I know I'm taking a while to get to the actual point that I have, but this is not the prime focus of the video. I do, however, think that it's very important to cover this. As I said, this is a great way. Like if you were to map all your ranges out with PBT Odds Oracle, and especially if you're going to adjust and have more specific preflop ranges for both you and your opponent, it's really great to be able to have an idea of how often you're going to have hands to put in each of these ranges, because it's one thing to say, okay, my opponent's c-betting the turn 60% of the time, but to be able to break down ranges and actually know what that means, I think is extremely valuable. And if I were a heads up no limit pro still, I actually would be making greater use of that tool. So here we have a range broken up. We have check folding range, which consists mostly of queen high or worse, no draw, and queen high or worse with a gut shot. You'll notice there's a B next to that, and there are actually three categories of queen high or worse. I had to break some of the ranges up because I think, first of all, queen high or worse is not specific enough. If I have, queen 9 on king 10 6 deuce, I'm not going to be check folding. Whereas, some of the like 7 8 hands, I mean, you could consider betting, but I think betting all the time with all of your non-showdown value gutters is going to be exploitable. I did come up with a range. I think this is not extremely accurate as far as, or not an extremely standard range. I think a bet percentage of 35% is a little bit low. I find that most people bet this spot more frequently, but I'm pretty happy with how well balanced I think my checking range is, which is an important part of this. And though I could spend a lot more time and tweak these ranges and make my betting range wider at the cost of my check call range, or the cost of my check fold range, or perhaps the cost of my check raise range, this gives us, at least a good idea of how ranges break down, and a way that you would go about breaking down your range, and one that I think a lot of the top heads up no limit guys are probably doing. that I personally am not. So once we check, we can knock out that piece that's our betting range and think about what our range looks like now, how often we're doing what against a bet. So here, once we check, we're raising 14% of the time, which I think is a pretty nice frequency. We're folding 37% of the time, which I also think is a pretty nice frequency. We don't want to make a bet immediately profitable for our opponents. And we'll get into it later, but if they're betting 80% pot or so, we are not folding often enough to make that profitable immediately. And, we're calling with almost half our hands. I think that perhaps we could take some of these calling hands, or a little bit from each category, like I said, and throw them into the betting range. But this gives you a good idea of what a checking range breakdown should look like, in my opinion. Whether we add more to the betting range and keep these proportional, I think that could be a little bit better. But this is what I consider a pretty balanced and good checking range. Which brings us back to talking about the in-position player strategy. So remember, in position, we raise, he calls, check, check, and he checks to us. And we're considering not only what to do with ace-6, but what to do with the rest of our range. So here now we know his range when he takes those actions. So from earlier, we had our basic assumptions of, we'll bet 10x and queen-6 plus for value, and we'll semi-bluff with a certain amount of hands. And I think that, is still a pretty good outline without going and getting into our exact frequencies of all these hands and how exploitable we are, and then changing his strategy to adjust for that and back and forth. This is still a roughly good idea of how we want our range to look. My question is now, do we want to bluff with some hands that are weaker than either of these? And that's what we'll get into next. I made some assumptions. I assume that if we bet total air, quote unquote air, and we get called by this 48.9% range, we're going to have 8% equity on average. And I assume when we check back against his entire checking range, which is obviously going to be weaker than his check call range, we're going to have 15% equity on average. And I'm leaving out considerations for river playability, which I do talk about all the time as being important, but this is just giving us a rough idea of our immediate fold equity, and this just accounts for a little bit of equity that we can't forget we have. So with a $75 bet, which is pretty standard, into a $100 pot, the 37% of the time he folds, we win $100. The just under 14% of the time he raises, we lose $75. And the just under half the time he calls, we lose $55. When you multiply those times their frequency, the frequency at which they occur, and add them up, you get that we're only losing 10 cents on a bet. However, that's compared to an EV of 0. So when we consider that checking, we have 15% equity in a $100 pot. Checking gives us $15 profit compared to just mucking our hand. The EV of betting versus the EV of checking, betting with our air actually costs us $15, which means we can most definitely not bet our total air against an opponent with this strategy. And it's actually so significant that our opponent probably doesn't even need this wide of a calling range to make us not want to bet air, because losing $15 on a $75 bet, I think is reasonably high. Anyways. So, we come up with the conclusion that bluffing with air isn't profitable, given the assumptions we've made, which I think are somewhat reasonable. We could get more specific with the average equity we have when called and the average equity we have when we check back, but certainly you can agree that we're going to have more equity when we check back than when we are called, and both of those numbers are going to be low given that we have quote-unquote total air. However, that's not really the real conclusion. The real conclusion that we came up with is that betting $75 with our air isn't profitable. Which leads me to the point of this video. I want to take a look at bluffing $30 with our air rather than just betting 75. If we take all the same assumptions, the math works out to make our $30 bet plus just under $10 in expected value. You might say that Phil, it's not that simple. They don't keep the same frequencies against a smaller bet, to which I would say, hi, you're right. However, if you think about it, the range that they checked with and the way that they've played the hand thus far, there's actually not that much they can do to change their frequencies. It's difficult for them to check raise thinner for value because they've bet all of their mid to strong value hands, other than the ones they're already check raising. So they're not going to take bottom pair and start value check raising it. And in addition, they can't check call much more often because the majority of their check fold range, if you recall, it was queen high or worse with no outs, or queen high or worse with a gutter. And with queen high, with literally queen high, and maybe with jack high with the gutter, they can check call against this small bet. But if they're sitting there with jack high and no outs, or they're sitting there with nine high and a gutter, or nine high and no outs, they can't really start calling with those hands, even though we've given them such a good price. I mean, perhaps they could, and certainly they can check raise more frequently. But by betting this smaller amount, and actually I should have specified as we get into now, I'm not suggesting that we bet $30 with our whole range. What I'm suggesting is that we bet $30 with some of our range, and we bet $75 with some of our range, at least to start. And so to counter that mixed strategy, they're going to need to alter their turn checking and betting ranges. As it says here, breaking them up even further and making frequencies that much more difficult to get a handle on. So let's say he adjusts by including more top pair type hands in his check raise range. Well, now when we have bigger hands, either because we slow played the flop or because we banked a turn, we can get three bets in with those hands. So occasionally he's going to be check raising too thinly for value. And with our weaker hands, now that he's checking more frequently because he's taking a lot of the strong hands, he's checking more frequently and more strong. We can actually take more free cards with our weak hands and realize some more equity. If he includes more weak showdown value and mid-strong draws in his check call range, so, certain hands that he wanted to bet with because he couldn't stand a larger bet, but had a little bit of equity or a little bit of showdown value, he was betting those before. But now that he may be facing a $30 bet, he actually can check call some of those, so he takes them out of his betting range, which is a reasonable adjustment. However, once again, he's adding to his checking range. We can get more free cards, and we aren't forced off our equity when he does have those hands. And we still bet larger with some of our hands because we do have a mixed strategy. We're not betting $30 every time. And what that means is some of these hands that he's now put into his range to check call a $30 bet that he would have otherwise bet himself because he can't check call a $75 bet, he's now going to have to check fold to the $75 bet. And these were hands that he was in the past realizing his equity with because he was betting, unless we were raising turns, but that's somewhat rare. Obviously, he can now check raise with those hands, but the point is that no matter what he does, he needs to check hands with more than one plan because not only are we betting $75 when he checks with a specific range, but we're betting $75 or $30. And so he can't say, I'm going to check call indiscriminately because he needs to know if he's check calling against a $75 bet or a $30 bet. And so, for instance, with queen high and a gutter, he might want to check fold, although you could actually argue for a check call, depending on our flop range, against a larger bet, but he wants to check call against a small bet. Maybe jack high and a gutter would be a better example, as to a hand that he normally would either want to bet or check fold, but against a small bet he wants to check call. And so if we were betting $30 every time, he would just simply take that hand and check call with it most of the time. If we were betting $75, he would either take it and check raise, check fold, or bet, but certainly not check call. But now that he doesn't know what action he's going to be facing, he has to check with multiple plans. Another example is, check calling with top pair, decent kicker against a large bet, but check raising for value against a small bet. And he's making some assumptions about our range, which may or may not be true, which we didn't get into, which is, our smaller bet is going to be for thinner value, more protection, and perhaps some more medium strength bluffs, whereas our larger bet is going to be more polarized. And I don't think that's necessarily I mean, we should, I think, break it up somewhat in that way, but we definitely will have balance and have certain hands in each of our ranges, or most hands, at some frequency in each of our ranges. But yeah, he now has to, let's say, top pair good kicker, he normally would be betting because it's clearly superior to check raising against a large bet or check calling against a large bet. And I mean, it's not, I shouldn't say clearly, but let's say he deems it that. If he wants to have that in his value check raise range, the times we bet small, now he needs to check with it, which means that he's playing it suboptimally against the range of hands that bets big because he would have liked to have bet if he knew we were going to bet big or check. So some more thoughts that I have about it. Hopefully you could tell from the last couple of slides. If we have one bet size in this spot, we're actually giving our opponent information before he even acts. And poker is a game that's so much about information and deception and hiding information that to give our opponent information before he even acts on a street when we're in position, it's just, I mean, that should make you feel sick, honestly. And the information he's getting is that we're going to do one of two things: we're going to check or we're going to bet $75. And a lot of players think that by doing this, their range is they can balance their range, which is true, and they're not readable because they don't change their bet size and their opponent can't get anything on them. But what they don't realize, in my opinion, is that, like I said here, they're giving their opponent information, and their opponent can correctly game plan before even acting on the turn. And to me, this seems like a very big leak, and one that, I mean, pretty much everybody I've played against in Heads Up No Limit and people that I've viewed play Heads Up No Limit, including all the best, it's a leak that I think they have. And I include here, perhaps I'm the one who's wrong, which, I do have less No Limit experience than these guys, but I think in the realm of theory rather than practice, I still feel very strong in even games that I'm not as familiar with. So I do actually feel pretty confident that this is a mistake that most people are making. So one of my concluding thoughts is that splitting your ranges, even though it is difficult and it will be time consuming if you want to balance it correctly, we didn't get into which hands we want to put in our $30 bet range, which hands we want to put into our $75 bet range, and the pros and cons of each bet size with various hands, and game planning for how our opponent's going to react. We didn't get into all of that, and all of that is important work that's going to take a lot of time. However, I think if you do the work, both in this spot and in various spots in No Limit Hold'em and other games, I think it's clearly superior, at least some of the time, to having only one bet size. So building ranges with multiple sizings, one thing to consider is that it's extra effective because in addition to all of the things we talked about, it's actually more difficult for your opponent to gauge your frequencies. I'm not as up to date as some people. I mean, I use a HUD and I use it fairly well, but I'm not up to date as some, or as tech savvy as some. But my HUD does not display frequencies for different bet sizes, so they can look at you and see that you're betting the turn 70% of the time. But if you're betting it, like if 50% of that 70%, meaning 50% of all your hands, is the smaller bet size, and only 20% is the larger bet size, they are not going to be aware of that unless they, do some exhaustive analysis in their own database on their own time. And I think that, the harder it is for your opponent to get a handle on what you're doing, the harder it is going to be for them to game plan. And this is something that I actually went into the matches thinking about. My thought process was, these are guys that have played much more Heads Up No Limit than me as of late. They have a much better grasp on ranges and equities with various ranges and how things play out. So I'm going to make myself as difficult as possible to read in terms of my frequencies because, I know that Jungle Man's going to know what to do against a double barrel frequency of 40% or 80%. But if I have, two or three bet sizes, it's going to be a lot harder for him to build a strategy to account for that. And even if he does build a strategy, with the assumption that I have similar ranges in all those bet sizes, and even if I do, he can't be sure of that, and he's going to have a level of insecurity in the fact that he could be making a play against a range that he's misinformed about. And I think that putting that seed of doubt in your opponent's minds is just super important. I mean, it's just huge, huge, huge. I mean, it's one of my goals in poker, and especially in heads-up poker, where psychology plays such a large role. Which brings me to the next point. Why only two bet sizes? Well, in this video, I was just attempting to prove that having two bet sizes is better than having one bet size. I do think that most likely, the best strategy will include a number of bet sizes, definitely including overbets and no limit. You know, the fact that you can bet more than the pot in no limit is a tool that you should use sometimes, which is something that people have gotten more and more accustomed to. Where else does this concept apply? It really applies everywhere. It can apply to pre-flop three betting, pre-flop opening, flop play, turn play, river play, in position, out of position. There's no reason other than the fact that I think it was an easy example to give, that it needs to be, that it's specific to turn delay C betting. And to wrap up, I just want to point out that I've yet to hear definitive proof that any of these things are false. Most people assume that betting 50 to 80% of pot on the flop is best in many forms of poker, but nobody, as far as I know, has proven that or given a very good definitive reason why it's true. I think it's very likely that in a lot of situations it is best, but I think taking things like this for granted and assuming they're true without question is just a big mistake. People used to have different preflop sizings than they do now, and as the game's evolved, we've learned that multiple sizings based on position are best. We actually, well, I'm going to get into it soon, actually. We assume that limping preflop is always bad, and now just in the last year, Sauce has started limping buttons in PLO, and it's something that everybody thought was terrible, and here Sauce is one of the best players in the world, and he's doing it, and obviously for good reason. And I think that because he's somebody who can think outside the box and come up with some ideas and then do the analysis to support it, he's able to figure things out before everybody else that's just going with the flow and making quote-unquote standard plays. He's able to get ahead of the curve in that way. Here's something that people feel very strongly about, which is that varying your preflop raise size or your 3-bet size based on hand value is bad. People will always say, well, you can raise to 2x on the button, you can raise to 3x in early position, but you have to do it with all the hands that you want to raise. And I would argue that that's not true. I think it's close enough that I don't think it's a huge deal. However, I am almost positive that if you were to take some time and game plan and make some well-balanced ranges based on actual hands, especially if you include hands at certain frequencies to like into each range like I was doing earlier, I think that varying your preflop raise size and your preflop 3-bet size for based on hand value and how hands play out, whether you want a hand to go multi-way, whether you want it to be more likely a heads-up pot, whether you want to take down the pot immediately, whether you want to discourage calls from the big blind and encourage him to play more of a raise or fold game, whereas let's say a smaller bet size, he'll call more, and some of the hands that he 3-bet against a larger open, like let's say, I mean this is all abstract, but let's say Jack 7 suited. He might 3-bet against the large open because he doesn't want to call. I'm assuming you're opening the button in a 6-max game for this example. But when you min-raise, he decides to call with it. There are definitely hands that you'd much prefer to play a 3-bet pot with or have him fold with compared to other hands where you'd rather see a flop in a single raise pot. And so I think that any time where vacuum plays would clearly be better with certain hands in your range, you should definitely give some good thought to building a range so that you can make those vacuum plays with some of those hands and obviously using some of your other hands to balance that out. Point is, never accept any strategy advice as fact, even from me. I think that you need to think through everything on your own, and people just kind of make statements all the time, and It's very easy in the small poker community, especially the small community of knowledge sharing that goes on training sites and on forums. It's very easy for somebody to start saying something and everybody to agree, and then every good player is saying it, every good poster is saying it, and then it's just taken as fact. And I think that for obvious reasons, that's not how things should be. You should always be exploring, which is my next bullet point. You should never stop questioning the quote unquote standard plays you make, and you should always consider all of your options, which really means that exhaustive math and range analysis is no substitute for logical thought. Which the point of this video was the example of bet sizing in various spots, and why I think very clearly you should have split ranges and a mixed strategy. But in general, I think that while doing a ton of analysis, given certain assumptions that are kind of obvious in the community or obvious to you for whatever reason, doing that analysis is extremely beneficial, and I would never discourage you from doing it. But you can't you can't just start from information, build on it, and never look back, because the assumptions could always be wrong. And that's why I feel that one of my strengths as a poker player is that I'm never sure of anything that I do. And unlike a lot of players that play nosebleeds, I'm always questioning the plays that I make. I always worry that I made a play that was wrong, and I think it through. And anytime I see an opponent make a play that I think is bad, I don't necessarily write them off as bad, although sometimes I do. But I look into the play further, especially if they're a player I respect. But that'll wrap it up. I hope you guys enjoyed the first part of this series. I have no release date schedule planned for when these things will come out in the mix of all my other videos. It kind of has to do with when I have some thoughts that I want to share, and also when I have the time and energy to dedicate to prepping something like this. I guess I'll leave you with that. I really hope that we can talk about in the forums. First of all, if anybody disagrees with my conclusions here, because obviously a lot of the majority of the high stakes no limit community doesn't play like I'm suggesting they should. So I would not be surprised if many people disagreed with me. And then, obviously, feel free to support what I said, and I hope as always, some discussion can go back and forth, not only with me but with you guys amongst each other. But I certainly will be in the forums and the comments section talking about this, because other than the fact that I would like to give you guys your money's worth, I also find it very interesting. Thanks for watching and listening. This has been Phil Galfon for RunItOnce.com. Take care, guys.